All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Will Empey. Oh, and I think I was already introduced, but I'm going to be talking about forward models and how to use them and how they're used for Ebsd. And a lot of what I'll show is currently available in Matrix, and then I'll show some upcoming functionality. So I'm going to start, for those who are not familiar, with some motivation about why we bother doing all of the hard work of forward model indexing. So here is a nice image from Mark DeGraff's group showing how much better you can resolve noisy or low quality Ebsd patterns with a forward model. So in this, it's a very heavily deformed material that's degrading your pattern quality, huff indexing on the left and the dictionary on the right. But you could have low quality patterns from very high exposure rate or low dose or other things like that. So in general, you're able to resolve much more difficult patterns. And then here's another example from nickel, same data set here, the same region exposed, different camera exposures. So you can see as the pattern quality gets worse and worse, huff indexing starts to fail because you can't detect the bands, but there's still a lot of information. For example, if you look where the prominent zone axis is, you can still sort of see that zone axis bright point even in the worst image. And that's enough information for the dictionary indexing to do a pretty decent job still. So in addition to noisy patterns, there's a bunch of other more advanced techniques you can do with these models. So it is worth all of the extra work when you have a data set like this. So I'm going to do a pretty high-level overview of how the Ebsd forward model works and how forward models work in general. And there is a very good paper for this if you want more of the technical details also out of Mark DeGraff's group. The basic idea is that most analysis problems are an inverse problem. You're measuring a signal and you want to know what generated the signal. Oftentimes that's mathematically an ill-posed problem. And so by doing a forward model, you instead simulate what the experiment does, and then you just compare your measured result to your simulation, and whichever parameters give you the best match, that's what your sample must be. So to do that, you need to model a whole sequence of physics. So starting with the source, then describing the beam that comes off of that source, your sample, which has a boundary or shape function, plus maybe a scalar value of interest like density or chemical composition, maybe a vector like orientation is a vector, or potentially even a tensor if you're doing some more advanced properties. And then after interacting with your sample, the beam will be modified in some way. So you simulate that, and then also your detector has some sensitivity and geometry parameters. So the goal is to capture the physics behind each one of those to be able to simulate the experiment. And so here's a little toy example for ray tracing, which is essentially a type of forward model. So your source is just a description of the illumination. So maybe you know that you want to light your scene with like a red, green, blue LED set. You can describe their intensity. Then you know that the beam comes off of that as a point source. So you can describe that geometry of the propagation. You describe your sample potentially in a very simple way, like you know that it's a cube with this color field over it. You model the reflection, and then you could use a very simple description of the detector. And so generally what you want to do with a forward model is start with something simple, see if the result is good enough, and then if it's not, you could add additional details of the physics. So maybe you need to add in Poisson noise to account for the graininess of your picture, or it's not sufficient to just have the light from your illumination. There's a background light or something like that. So generally, you're going to start simple and add details until the model is accurate enough for your needs. So Ebsd is a slightly more complicated problem, but it's exactly the same framework, with the slight complication that because it is a more intense process to simulate, to make it computationally tractable, it's in the formulation used in EMSoft, which is what Matrix uses. It's split into essentially 3 separate forward models. One is a forward model just to describe the backscatter yield. Then there's a second model to describe the diffraction, and then finally a third set to combine those and simulate a pattern from them, which is the ultimate goal. So I'll step through a high-level overview of how each of those work, because it's important to understand where the patterns are coming from to be able to use them successfully. So the backscatter yield is a pretty standard Monte Carlo simulation. So in this case, the source is just a monochromatic electron beam. So you'll pick 20 kV or whatever the accelerating voltage of the experiment you're targeting is. And then you run this Monte Carlo simulation. This is pretty fast normally, seconds to minutes, depending on the number of electrons you run. And you calculate for each electron that goes in, you calculate the final depth of the scattering before it exits, what the exit vector is, and what the exit energy is. And so what you get out is that matters most for the simulation is basically over the full hemisphere of your sample, what is the yield in that direction for each energy bin. So you pick some resolution, in this case 0.4 kV, and count how many electrons fall in each of those bins in each direction. And so that's what this is showing. And you can see because of the tilt, obviously you get much more electrons coming out at the bottom from that 70-degree sample tilt. And there's a peak right shortly below the incident energy, and then it dies off pretty quickly. So you can choose sort of how far down in energy to go before you cut off and stop counting. And the lower you go in energy, the more realistic you'll capture that tail, but also the more energy bins you'll have to handle, which will make the simulation take longer for pattern generation. Okay. And then the next part, sorry about that, is the actual diffraction simulation. And this uses a block wave approach to generate this master pattern, is what it's called in the paper. And this is basically for each crystal direction, what is the diffracted intensity relative to some input. And so what you use again here is a monochromatic source, but now instead of it being like a beam coming into the sample, it's a point source within the sample, because you already have the location that the electron came from the previous model. So for each energy bin, you do this separately, and you get this whole series of Kikuchi spheres. So that's the dynamical part. And this is by far the slowest part of the simulation. It can take at least tens of minutes for a high symmetry material with not very many energy bins. And if you have a lot of energy bins and a lower symmetry material, which means there's more of the sphere that you have to handle independently, it can take hours or potentially a couple of days for very low symmetry materials. But you only have to do it once, and then you can use that for any orientation. And so here's showing from that example before what that looks like for a couple of different energy bins. And as you go to the lower kV, you get the bands widening out, which is why you have to do each one of these separately, even though it's the same crystal structure. And then finally, to simulate a pattern, you have this third basically geometric model that combines the two. So the general idea is that you have some baseline intensity over the hemisphere from your Monte Carlo simulation, and you also have diffraction intensity from the dynamical simulation, and you're basically going to multiply those two together with the crystal diffraction pattern rotated by the orientation that you're interested in. And then you use, on the right, just the geometry of the detector to figure out where each of those directions projects onto your detector. And once you have that for one energy, you do it for every other energy and add them all up, and that final sum is your simulated pattern. And you can also choose to capture some of the detector details if you want, like if you know you have some barrel distortion, or you can add realistic noise if that's needed. And these generally produce pretty high quality patterns. So here's some simulated patterns on the right. So now that we have these patterns, how do you actually use them to index a scan? So for normal Huff indexing, you have a pattern from the detector, and you are using it to try to back out the orientation. The forward model lets us go the other direction. And to determine the orientation, we just compare against all possible patterns and pick the best match. So then the question is, how do we pick the best match, and what is the set of all possible patterns? So the answer to the first question is very simple. You just use some image comparison metric. You can use anything you want. In general, people have used normalized dot product for two reasons. One, it's really cheap, and you're going to have a lot of patterns to compare against, so you want something that's fast. And it's also invariant to contrast adjustments. And so if you do a high-pass filter on the simulated and the experimental pattern, and then use normalized dot product as your metric, you are invariant to contrast and brightness adjustments, which is generally all that you should have to worry about for EBSD patterns. And also the high-pass filter can get rid of the background if you don't capture the background quite right. The Monte Carlo simulation should do a good job of giving you a realistic background, but oftentimes you're doing a background subtraction on the patterns as you collect them to get better use of the dynamic range on the camera. So your patterns won't have that background anyway. And then the all possible patterns part is slightly more complicated. Basically what you have to do is grid all of orientation space. And there is a somewhat complicated way of doing this that involves a new orientation representation. If you want the details, I'm happy to talk about that during the questions. But the basic idea is that you pick some resolution and generate a 3D grid of all orientations at that resolution, and then simulate a pattern for each one of those. And so it turns out that if you do that for a resolution that's on the order of the angular resolution that we can achieve with EBSD, it becomes impractically large. So instead, you have to choose something closer to a degree, and then do a subsequent refinement step to sort of interpolate between the grid points. So just to sort of show you how big that dictionary can become, obviously it depends on the crystal symmetry, because you have more unique orientations for lower symmetry groups. So at low symmetries, it can become extremely large, and your indexing time is going to scale directly with the dictionary size, because you have to compare every experimental pattern against every single pattern in your dictionary. And it turns out that normally somewhere in the 1 to 3 degree window range is what's the best trade-off between being fine enough that the subsequent refinement is reasonable, but coarse enough that it doesn't take forever without getting too coarse that you're unable to get a close match. So if you see this, if you index with a 5 degree result, then there's orientations that are too far away from a grid point to have a good match against your dictionary, and you get bad results. And so once you've done the dictionary indexing, you have discrete orientations that you're indexing against. So you can see here in the middle, there is discrete steps where you have a subtle orientation gradient. You're going from one grid point to the next, even though the orientations themselves are continuous. Because the dictionary discretizes orientation space, you get this sort of choppy looking result, which means that you have to do this subsequent refinement step to give you the true smooth orientation field. And this refinement step is particularly challenging because it's a nonlinear optimization to basically maximize your dot product. And it's a relatively large parameter space because it's not enough generally to fit just the orientation. You're also normally going to want to fit the pattern center at each point. And so with 6 degrees of freedom, you can get a lot of space to search very quickly. And it's not really practical to do a brute force approach. And also, it's because of the way that the model works, we don't have derivatives available, which makes the optimization methods limited. And on top of all that, simulating the patterns with the CPU approach that EMSoft uses is relatively slow. Normally something like 2,000 patterns per second. You can multi-thread it, but that only buys you so much space. And so you have this trade-off where you want the largest dictionary possible, the largest step between orientations possible for your dictionary to minimize the size of the dictionary. But that means that your refinement step has a larger search space. And so you're basically stuck on this constant speed band, and there's no way to avoid paying a penalty on either the initial indexing or on the subsequent refinement step. So the approach that EMSoft uses, and that's what's exposed through Matrix for doing refinement, is this Bobekua approach, which is bounded optimization by quadratic approximation. And the idea is that you're going to start with a bounds based on your dictionary, right? You know the best fit, the best point in your dictionary, so you can go to the upper and lower bounding points on your orientation grid, and that gives you an orientation bound. And then you'll basically just have to pick a bound for pattern center shift, which is a separate problem that I will address a little bit more later. And the idea is that you take the points you have near the peak, fit them with a quadratic, use the quadratic fit to say, here's where the local minima of that quadratic is. That should be close to our actual minima. Evaluate the orientation at that point. So you're going to, at this new gray point, simulate a pattern, do the dot product, and get the metric, which is hopefully better than all of the points you have so far. And then you just are going to iteratively do that until some convergence criterion, which is normally going to be something like you have a fixed number of iterations, or you have a small step between 2 iterations or something like that. So the places that this can run into challenges is if you don't have a good pattern center fit on your initial dictionary, then because small pattern center shifts and small orientation changes have very similar effects on what the pattern looks like, if your pattern center is off, then your true best fit is going to be outside of your search box, which means you'll get to the best place within the search box, but there's a better place outside that is inaccessible. So you can have some trouble there. Or if your dictionary is too coarse to accurately be captured by a parabola locally, then the refinement's not going to do a good job. So that could mean that it will eventually get there, but take a lot of steps, or it may never get there if there's too complex of a structure within the search window. And so the pattern center fit is important so that your grid is right, and pattern center fit and orientation refinement are actually the exact same process. It's just that in one case you care about what's the orientation of the best fit simulation, and in the other case you care about what is the pattern center of the best fit orientation. And so we can look to how pattern center fit is done for sort of other opportunities for doing refinement. So there's basically two approaches that are done right now for pattern center fit. One is basically just what I showed, something like BobaQA, where you have a relatively complex search algorithm to minimize the number of times you have to evaluate your metric, because, for example, simulating a pattern, if your metric requires that you simulate a pattern, then it's going to be slow and expensive to do that. Or you can do something that is very cheap to evaluate, like fit quality, and just do a brute force because it's fast. And so that's, if you do the pattern center tune in analysis, that's the approach that's done there, is that you are using the band fit to minimize, and that's very inexpensive, so you can evaluate a bunch of different parameters very quickly to just say where is the best over a high density grid. And just to give you a sense of how intractable this can become, if you want to search a 2-degree orientation space at a 1/10 of a degree resolution and a 4-pixel wide pattern center shift at a 1/10 of a pixel, at 2,000 patterns per second, it's going to be an hour to brute force it. So it's really not viable for the Ford model to do right now. So I should see a question, but on this figure, and I'll go back for the previous ones, these are just to try to show quality of match. So it's like your dot product, where in this case, the dark green would be the best match, and as it gets closer to white, that's a worse and worse match between the patterns. So in this example, there is sort of 2 local minima within the search region because the grid is too coarse. Okay. So yeah, for both generating the dictionary and for doing refinement, pattern simulation is the real bottleneck that we have. So here's just sort of a set of some reasonable parameters for a couple of different symmetries. And you can see that simulating for even a relatively coarse 2-degree dictionary for a moderate symmetry material like tetragonal takes about a minute, which is not a huge amount of time, but this is for 96 by 96 patterns. So if you have something like 256 squared, multiply everything by 7, and you can see that especially for low symmetry materials, both the size of the dictionary and the time that it takes to calculate becomes very computationally expensive. And so it would be nice and the other thing is, if you, for example, update your pattern center, you have to regenerate the whole dictionary. So it would be nice if we could do this faster. So what we have now that is hopefully going to be available in the next couple of months is a GPU implementation of pattern simulation, which gives you a factor of about 100 speed up. So you can see that obviously it's not going to decrease the size of the dictionary, but you can see that even this 1-degree no symmetry dictionary, you can generate the whole thing in about 40 seconds. So it's fast enough that you don't have to store anything on the disk, and you can sort of just generate things on the fly. And that faster pattern simulation gives you a lot of flexibility with algorithms in general. So it makes some things that were not tractable as a brute force feasible. For example, that hour to do a 2-degree and 4-pixel window search for pattern center, you could brute force that in a second instead of an hour. Or it gives you a lot of possibilities for other approaches that are not practical, with dictionary generation being an offline approach. So you could generate dictionaries for specific things on the fly, like if you have pseudosymmetry that you're trying to resolve, or you can use algorithms that require more evaluations than something like BobaQA, but less than brute force, that give you a better trade-off between number of evaluations and algorithm robustness. So I'm going to show an example with this particle swarm optimization algorithm, which is a pretty commonly used approach. And the idea is that instead of just doing a brute force grid or something that is very parsimonious like the BobaQA, you seed your search space with a bunch of random points and then give them each a random velocity. And then you do an iterative approach where each point is accelerated towards a combination of the best point that everyone has found and the best point that it's found over the course of the algorithm. And this requires much fewer evaluations than a brute force grid to get a similar resolution. And it enables you to search a large window, even something like this, which has lots of local minima, and still do a good job finding the maxima. And so what I did is I used this algorithm with our faster pattern simulation to do, here you can see a pretty large search window in both orientation and in a very large window in the pattern center fit itself. And so I started off the first pattern with a relatively large error, and here on the next slide is the result. So on the left here, it's flipping back and forth between the simulated pattern for a orientation and pattern center that I picked as the answer, because this is purely simulated, and the starting point. So you can see how big of an error it is visually, that 1.5 degrees plus a 15-pixel pattern center shift. Oops. And on the right is after doing this particle swarm optimization. And it is still flipping back and forth. It's just that it's so small, it's very difficult to see. And so here on the right is showing the difference between those two images. And it's basically a gray level. And that recovers the true answer to about 1/5 of a degree and 1/20 of a pixel. Oh, I'm not sure why it keeps doing that. And this is a big enough search window that you can just put in some default approximation, like that the pattern center is in the middle and 2/3 of the way up, and that's close enough to get you to the right answer. Compared to normal, the existing pattern center optimizations, you generally have to start off pretty close. And here's an example of the same thing applied to some real data. So I just picked a grid of points here. That's what's shown with the red points on the left. The center column is the raw patterns, and then the last one is with a large window NLPAR applied to it. So if you have a data set, a noisy data set that you're trying to do pattern center fit on, it can be really helpful to do NLPAR to get higher quality patterns, because it really helps clean them up, and the time doesn't really matter that much because it's so few patterns that you can really crank the window size up to a very large size to get good patterns. So to fit the pattern center on this data set, just as a fixed pattern center instead of dynamic across the scan, I picked these 10 points. I did NLPAR to improve the pattern, and then apply this particle swarm optimization on each one, just starting from a pattern center of 0.5, 0.7, 0.7. So just sort of a generic rough estimate for a pattern center, plus the Huff indexed orientation. Sorry, it seems like it is not happy with the animations. And you can see this is flipping back and forth between the NLPAR and the simulated pattern. So you can see how good of a job this does in matching. If you've tried doing pattern center fit with Bobicule, then you may sometimes see that you get sort of a distortion where the pattern center is slightly off, but the orientation corrects for it. And these are a very good match. The red values here are the normalized dot products. And I used the same set of 9 NLPAR patterns to compute the pattern center with a couple of other algorithms. Oh my goodness. A couple of other algorithms, and you can see the results here. You end up getting very good agreement between the existing analysis approach. Apologies for this switching back and forth. Let me. You get very good agreement between the particle swarm and the existing approach in analysis, with the caveat that this one I had to manually draw the bands in to get good results. And also good agreement with the with this PC global algorithm, which is basically the state of the art right now, in my opinion, for getting a good quality pattern center fit. You can see that the Bobicule algorithm did not do quite as good of a job, and that's probably because the search window was not quite big enough. And it can tend to get stuck in local minima on the way to the answer if you're too far off. So you can also use this type of approach. Refinement is the same thing that you use to do pseudosymmetry resolution with forward model indexing. So basically the idea is, instead of just refining around the peak orientation in your dictionary, you're also going to refine around the symmetrically related orientation for all of the variants. So here's an example of a system that I'll show, Zirconia, which has a very slight tetragonality if you use the double cell. So you can see here in the bottom, the red box is the cubic unit cell, and the blue is the tetragonal. So if you do a double unit cell instead of the primitive tetragonal unit cell, oh my goodness. Then it is very small change. So this third master pattern on the lower right here shows switching between the cubic master pattern and the tetragonal pattern rotated 45 degrees about Z. And you can see it's a very small change. So this is a really challenging material to resolve the pseudosymmetry in. And just to sort of show how close these are, this is the 3 different variants being simulated on the left. So you can see it's basically a very slight distortion between the 3 variants. And then on the right, I'm showing compared with a real pattern. So on the right, the first column is one variant, the second column another, the third column the final. I am going to switch, bear with me for a minute, I'm going to switch to doing a screen share so that we don't have this problem with the slides advancing. All right. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. I tried to do a screen share, but needed to install software, and it cut the sound out. So I'm going to stick with this and try to stay on top of the slides, switching back and forth. Apologies for that. So on this slide, which is now not animated, you can see the values here without the animation at least. Are, again, the red numbers are the dot product, and you can see between the simulated patterns and the experimental patterns, there's an extremely small difference between the variants. So the blue one on top here has the biggest difference between the two, the best variant and the next best variant. So you can see in this case, variant 2 is the best with a normalized dot product of 99.49% compared to variant 3. And the green one is the smallest difference. Okay, and on the bottom here, it's a very small difference. So you can see 0.97 versus, or sorry, 0.9961 versus 0.9962. So they're essentially indistinguishable in this case. And so the way that the current state of the art for resolving this kind of problem is some work by that same group as PC Global, where you basically do a 2-pass step. So sorry, can people actually see the slides? There may be some it's not clear if that is the case. Okay, so sounds like we can see them. Sorry about the technical difficulties. So sorry, the existing state of the art for pseudosymmetry resolution is this paper out of Chris Shu's group, where you do 2 passes. First, you do a regular Huff indexing, and secondly, you, around each of the orientations you identify in your Huff indexing, you build a mini dictionary of a very high resolution, and then do a normal dictionary indexing approach with those patterns. And you have to do that for each of the pseudosymmetric variants. And this works very well. but because the existing pattern simulation is slow, it's sort of an offline, slower process. The other challenge is that you have to make a dictionary for every orientation. So either you're going to need to, if you have a big data set like this one on the right, you're going to have to generate a lot of dictionaries, which is going to slow you down. And if you want to keep things simple, you would be indexing each point against all of these mini dictionaries, which means the computation time is going to explode. So instead, you have to sort of break the data set into small chunks, make the mini dictionaries per chunk, and it becomes a lot more complicated. So you can instead just do the particle swarm approach. So here's a little patch from the center of that data set in the center column, showing the pseudosymmetry issues in the Huff index. And if you do the Huff index and then do a particle swarm optimization on the orientation that was indexed using the Huff indexing, and the same thing for the two pseudosymmetric variants, and then pick the maximum dot product, you end up with a much cleaner result. This is not the fastest, but it's about 3 times fewer evaluations than doing the small dictionary approach. And you can see you end up with a pretty clean normalized dot product map. And there is still some noise from the pseudosymmetry, but if you look at the difference between the best dot product and the next best dot product for the second best variant, and build a metric using that, then you at least know where you're able to clearly resolve the variant. So on the top here is colored by orientation plus normalized dot product, and then the next column is orientation plus this variant confidence measure. And so you can at least do a good job of knowing where you have the variant determined accurately. And then because it is much more practical to expand to a large data set, you can do the whole thing and it doesn't take any extra infrastructure or complexity compared to the smaller region. So you can achieve a lot with faster pattern generation, but there are some challenges that you just can't brute force with faster speed. And that's because the existing dictionary implementation that EMSoft has, which is, again, what's currently exposed by Matrix, is already using GPU code for the initial indexing step. And so this GPU implementation for the simulation is a significant speed up, something like a factor of 100 for the refinement step, but refinement is only maybe 10 or 20% of the indexing time for the dictionary approach. And there's no more room to improve the speed of the dictionary part without an algorithm change. And so there's a couple of ways you could conceive of doing that, and I'm going to show in the next couple of slides the idea behind spherical indexing, which is something that's going to be hopefully available soon for people to start trying out in Matrix. So, and I believe this should be the end of my troubled slide transitions. The general idea for the spherical indexing, I'm going to demonstrate with a 2D analog. So going back to the explanation of how the dictionary indexing works, if you imagine that you have some master pattern and your detector samples a part of that, just like, so in this case, the detector is a translation plus you capture part of the image. For Ebsd, the detector is rotation from the orientation plus you capture some of the image. So in this case, indexing is to get, instead of the orientation, the translation. And so just like you can imagine a dictionary for a grid of 3 orientation space, we can make a dictionary for a grid of 2D translations. So here the green circles are showing some translations, and then on the bottom there is a translated plus cropped image according to those. And then if you evaluate the normalized dot product for all possible translations, that's what this image on the right is. So our indexing would be to do this in 3D for orientations, and then pick the peak, which is this point here, and that's our orientation. And if you just put the pattern that corresponds to that crop there, you can that translation, you can see how well that it matches. So that is the correct translation, and it's the same thing we see in indexing. But and that's basically how dictionary indexing works, but for orientations. But for 2D translations, you can do this with a Fourier transform and do it in the frequency domain instead of doing it in real space. And the general idea is you basically take the Fourier transform of your master path, your reference image, and your template, and convolve them by multiplying in frequency domain and then doing the inverse Fourier transform. So this image here, if you zero out the average of each of the images, is identical mathematically to this image on the left, except you can compute it in it's much more efficient computationally. Instead of being on the order of the number of the side length of the image, it's squared, it's side length times log of side length. So it's a big complexity reduction, provided that and it works very well provided that you make the mean of the images 0. Because otherwise, if you don't make the mean of this master image 0 before doing the correlation, then brighter points in the image are going to have a higher correlation, and darker points will have a lower correlation. But if you zero them out, it works very well. So the question is, can we apply this to orientations, which instead of being a translation in 2D is a rotation in 3D? Is there some frequency type approach that works the same way, where now our master image is the master pattern from the forward model, and the search template is our back projected detector image? And the answer is yes, but it uses spherical harmonics. And just like a sine and cosine form an orthogonal basis for one-dimensional functions, spherical harmonics form an orthogonal basis for functions on the sphere. And just like you can pick a degree of Fourier transform, you can pick how far out in frequency space to go for spherical harmonics, and that's normally called bandwidth. So it's a 2-dimensional grid of functions instead of just a sine and cosine. But normally you go to the same extent in both. And so people generally are going to refer to that as bandwidth. So if you see bandwidth for the remainder of the talk, in this case, this is showing a bandwidth of 4, because you're going down to a degree of 4 and over to an order of 4. And just like you can use sines and cosines to do a Fourier transform, you can use these spherical harmonics to do a spherical harmonic transform. The math is significantly more complex, but conceptually identical. So the forward Fourier transform, the equivalent for a spherical harmonic transform, is this double integral over the function of interest f times these basis functions ylm, and then the inverse Fourier transform equivalent is this sum over of your weights f hat here times the spherical harmonic basis functions, and the extra complexity basically comes from, whereas the basis function for sines and cosines is this complex exponential, for spherical harmonics it's this Legendre function, which has to be evaluated recursively instead of directly analytically. So it computationally is much more involved, but conceptually is exactly the same thing. And just like you can do real space correlation in 2D with a Fourier transform, you can do a correlation over orientation with a spherical harmonic transform. And again, the math is much more involved, but what you can get is that on a 3D grid of orientation, the correlation as a function of rotation on that grid is the inverse Fourier transform of a product of spherical harmonics. And just like the 2D case reduces the complexity from n squared to n log n, this reduces the complexity from n to the fifth to n cubed log n. So the most expensive step is this 3D Fourier transform. And here's some, just to demonstrate that it works, there is an existing implementation that I wrote available for CPU, but it is not quite fast enough to be real-time on normal systems. So here is the same data I showed at the beginning with the comparing Huff to dictionary, here showing it Huff to the spherical indexing. And you can see that it agrees very well. And there is also a refinement available for this technique. And again, as the Huff indexing starts to struggle with the noise, because this is nearly mathematically identical to doing the dictionary approach, it has the same robustness against noise. So you can see at these extreme noise levels, it starts to, you need to go further out in the frequency space to get a good answer. But when you do go into those higher order harmonics being included, you start recovering comparable results. So here's the, excuse me, the dictionary result just for comparison. And we start getting a similar robustness to noise somewhere in this bandwidth of 100. And just like the Huff indexing has confidence index, or dictionary indexing has normalized dot product, there is a confidence measure available for spherical indexing. So that's what's shown on the right here. And in this case, has very good correlation with image quality. So this is, there's an implementation of this that I've almost finished getting implemented as GPU code instead of CPU code, which should have a corresponding speed increase. And we're hoping that that's going to be available before too long. And so also just before I finish, there is an upcoming webinar available for crystallographic and strain mapping. And that is going to be, I believe, 2 weeks from today. Yeah, 2 weeks from today if you're interested. So that's all the slides I have, and I'll be happy to stick around for as long as people want to answer any questions. Sorry again about the technical difficulties. If there's slides that you want me to sort of cover again because there was difficulty with that also, feel free to ask a question about that. And yeah, looks like we have a question on slide 28. Let me bring that one up. Okay. Can you explain the differences between X star and XPC values? It seems like they should match. So Pattern Center has multiple ways to be expressed. Oh, and it's going to give me difficulty. I'm going to pull up a slide that doesn't have this problem. So you can express Pattern Center. X star, Y star, Z star in the EDAX convention are fractional detectors. So 0.52 is 52% of the way over from the left edge of the detector. EMsoft uses XPC, YPC, ZPC, which is essentially different units. So instead of being a fractional detector, it is how many pixels over from the center of the image is it. So in this case, 52% of the way from the left edge of the detector is 2.2 pixels from the center of the detector. So it's just a different convention. I believe in Matrix you can use whichever one you want, and it will convert as appropriate. In general, EDAX uses the fractional detectors. So hopefully that answers the question. We also have another question about pseudosymmetry, which says, what happens if we add additional difficulty? Let's say that you have a mix of both phases in a sample, the slight tetragonal one and the same lattice but fully cubic. Would that be too many degrees of freedom? My guess is that the software would need to know somehow beforehand if the pattern is tetragonal or cubic. So the answer is that as you add more phases, let me see if I have a good slide for this. As you add more phases, it's essentially identical to adding more variance, or they're indistinguishable. So if you look at this grid, for lack of a better figure available, this is the grid of orientations. But when you generate your dictionary, I guess I'll pull this one up. When you generate your dictionary, that's a dictionary for that one phase. So if you want to index against multiple materials, you generate a dictionary for every material you're interested in. You index against all of them, and then instead of just picking the best orientation, you pick the best orientation for each material and do the refinement for each one, and then pick the best across materials, and that's how you do the phase discrimination. And so if you have something like the slight tetragonal and the cubic in the same scan, you should be able theoretically to distinguish them. It's just a question of how differentiable they are. So if you have perfect patterns, then you should be able to resolve the phase as long as you have sufficient resolution. And you can test that out with a purely simulated experiment. So if you have the master pattern for the cubic phase and the tetragonal phase, you can generate some simulated patterns and see how difficult are these to tell apart, and how much noise can they tolerate before I can't tell them apart. Or if I simulate them but with one pattern center and then shift the pattern center ever so slightly and index them against that pattern center, how much does that degrade the accuracy, to give you an idea of how good of a pattern center fit is needed to be able to discern those. So there's all kinds of really interesting stuff you can do by simulating patterns. Theoretically, yes, you should be able to tell them apart. The question for how many degrees of freedom is too much, there's basically two parts. One is that the more phases you index against, it's however many phases you index. If you index against 5 phases, it's going to take 5 times as long as if you index against one phase, because you have 5 times more dictionaries to compare against. In terms of too many degrees of freedom, you can, for example, simulate patterns with different strains, but right now it's not really tractable to try to use that to back out the strain directly with a brute force approach, because it's so many degrees of freedom that the parameter space is too big. But I believe that that's areas with ongoing work. So right now, anything is technically possible in terms of degrees of freedom. It's just at some point it would become intractable, and that's going to depend a lot on the system. All right, and then here's another question. Can you explain the pros and cons of resolving pseudosymmetry using the point swarm, dictionary indexing, and spherical indexing? So advantage of the particle swarm is that it is more efficient, basically. So if you look at this slide, they do 3 dictionary. I think they do a 9 by 9 by 9 dictionary around each of the 3 variants, which gives you this 2187 patterns for each orientation cluster that they have. And the particle swarm only needed something like 800 simulations to get to converge. And so it wasn't quite as robust, but it was 3 times faster. So the trade-off between those two is really just about sort of efficiency. As for the dictionary, it's sort of the same thing. So let me pull up the dictionary. So the existing dictionary uses the Bobekua algorithm, which is sort of at one extreme, a very minimal number of evaluations. So it tries to get the answer with minimal evaluations possible, but then it's sort of the most sensitive to if you start too far away, or if your search space is too large, or there's some weird local minima. So the advantage of that approach is that it's very efficient in terms of number of evaluations, but the least robust against those type of issues. At the other end is on the right here, something like a brute force grid. It is going to be extremely robust against local minima or something like that, as long as the grid covers the space that contains the maxima. But it's extremely expensive in terms of number of patterns you have to simulate. And then something like the particle swarm is a hybrid in between those two extremes, where you can sort of get a better coverage of space at the expense of more evaluations, but not quite as many as you would need to do a brute force grid. So it sort of depends on, I guess, your patience, the difficulty of your problem, and your computational resources. Hopefully that answers that question. I don't see any other questions, but if anybody has any, I'd be happy to stick around. All right, so I am going to close the talk. If people have any questions later, you can feel free to email them in. So thanks for attending. Sorry again for the technical difficulties.